So, we are going to talk about panpsychism now. To set this up, Philip Goff talks about the problem of consciousness. And he talks about how Galileo divided the world into different kinds of entities. This is going to sound a lot like Descartes, okay? The physical and the non-physical. But while doing this, he bracketed off sensory qualities like sound, tastes, feelings as forms of consciousness in the non-physical domain. So the reason he did this is because he wanted to be able to focus science on things that could be represented through mathematics. And to do this, to use quantitative methods to understand the world, allowed science to potentially, sort of, in his view, like understand everything physical about the world. So he articulated the same mind-body problem that we talked about with Descartes in sort of a more scientific way. So in Goff's book, Galileo's Error, he talks about, instead of replacing or sort of bracketing off the sensory qualitative, or what we were calling before qualia, parts of the world, that instead we take consciousness to be a fundamental feature of physical reality. So there are different ways of sort of cashing this out, and different varieties of what he calls panpsychism, or what many people call panpsychism. But for him, he means that the fundamental or elemental constituents of the universe have a kind of consciousness. So there might be parts of the universe that have simpler consciousnesses, like atoms and quarks and so on, and then there might be other parts, like higher animals and humans, that have more complex forms of consciousness. So you might just think, well, okay, so what? Now we've got dualism problems with the tiny particles and not just with humans and animals. But he wants to say that consciousness is not something separate from the physical or reducible to the physical, but instead it's a thing in itself that's a fundamental part of the universe. So these cells that make up the brain have a simple form of consciousness, and the larger system has a more complex form of consciousness. And what we normally call physical properties of matter might just be forms of consciousness. It all gets a little weird, but as you see when we go through this, you'll kind of maybe see how it's motivated a bit more. And going back to science, part of his motivation for this view is that science doesn't really tell us about what he calls the intrinsic nature of things. So science can predict the behavior of things up to a point, at least on the macro level. So physics is pretty good at figuring out what's going to happen if you roll a ball down a hill. But when we get to the elemental particles and we talk about what the ball is made of, and especially when we get to the tiny little particles, science, he says, doesn't really have an answer. Science doesn't talk a lot about intrinsic natures. So it tells us what an atom is and what an atom does, and that's what it is for science. But it doesn't tell us sort of what the atom is made of, what is the elemental, what he calls intrinsic nature of an atom. And so English astronomer Arthur Eddington, in a long time ago, I want to say the 1900s, 1800s, proposed that the intrinsic nature of the universe is actually consciousness. So at the very basic level, that's what the universe is. And that's what Goff and other panpsychists have picked up on. So Goff argues that something like integrated information theory is compatible with panpsychism because a system with the right kind of interconnectedness, if a system with the right kind of connectedness has consciousness, the consciousness is not something special over and above the physical. It's part of the system. So he wants consciousness to be not something separate the way Descartes did, where you partition it off, or Galileo, where you partition it off and say, okay, the physical is this and the mental is this. He wants to say, but at the other hand, he doesn't want it to reduce to the physical in the way that the identity theorists did, where the identity theorists just said, okay, well, there really isn't any mental, it's really all just physical. So he wants to say that mental is something, but that it's something that's integral to and fundamental to the rest of the universe. So one of the biggest problems that panpsychism has is something called the combination problem, and this is the idea that, okay, well, if these little particles in the universe have consciousness, how do they come together to form a larger consciousness like the human mind? And integrated information theory can sort of begin to solve this problem, but it turns out to be rather difficult to figure out how this is going to work, because you have a lot of different options and possibilities, all of which have their own problems. So one possibility is that the little consciousnesses that form the atoms, say, in our brain, when they come together and they form a brain or larger system, they lose their own consciousness. Another possibility is that they keep their own consciousness and there's a sort of layered reality, so that brains have consciousness, or animals, let's say, have consciousness, atoms have consciousness, and there are these levels of consciousness that all exist at the same time. But figuring out how the bigger macro consciousness comes out of the smaller micro consciousness turns out to be kind of a difficult puzzle to figure out. And one solution sounds a lot like integrated information theory, which is to say that, okay, split brain patients are people who have had part of their brain split off from other parts, and their consciousness becomes in a weird way radically disunified. So people who have split brains like this sometimes won't know what their left hand is doing, whereas they will know what their right hand is doing, for example. And they will see things happen that they are doing and not really understand why, in this weird disunified consciousness kind of way. So this Luke Roloff uses this example to say, well, okay, when the particles and the parts of the brain are unified in just the right way, then you have consciousness. When they're disunified, then you don't. So when you die, there's a radical disunity of these particles, and that's when consciousness disappears. So again, it does sound a lot like integrated information theory. There's a lot to work out here, but this just gives you a hint at some of the difficulties that we have with this theory. But you can see what the attraction of it is to try to say, look, yes, consciousness is something different from the physical, but it's at the same time fundamental to the physical. That's the basics of panpsychism and what it's supposed to do.